All right, good morning. My name is Erin Collins. I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director for the Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar entitled No Reservations, the Importance of the Hospitality Industry in the Fight Against Human Trafficking. Our panelists and facilitator today include Corporal Alan Wilkett, Savannah Parvu, Dennis Hanks, and Ingrid Knudsen. Alan, I'll turn it over to you now.
First of all, thank you, Erin. Erin is one of my bosses. I have many of those, and she's one of those as the Executive Director for the Florida Alliance. What a privilege to be on here today. And hello to everyone that joined, and thank you for joining us. My name is, and I'm going to say this with emphasis, is now retired Corporal Alan Wilkett. Today's webinar is titled No Reservations, the Importance of the Hospitality Industry in the Fight Against Human Trafficking, and it's hosted by the Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking. The theme of this webinar is to discuss the recently enacted legislation which went into effect in January of 2021 that requires all public lodging establishments to provide, and I think this is the key, to provide annual training on human trafficking awareness to their employees, which include those who perform housekeeping duties in rental units or who work in the front desk, reception area, those who are responsible for checking guests in or guests out. So that legislation really dealt with the hospitality industry, and in particular, hotels, motels, and rental units. And so today, as the summer season is approaching, we wanted to highlight that particular issue and talk about it a little bit today. Human trafficking certainly as an issue, but also how it relates particularly to the hospitality industry. And as we all know, Florida is a destination year-round for visitors to our theme parks. We have great attractions here, marvelous beaches, state parks, and so much more. And in that, it includes a great attraction to a lot of tourism coming to the state of Florida. As such, Florida has the opportunity to really disrupt this human trafficking activity, which is attracted just as tourists are. Traffickers are attracted to that same industry, tourism, high capacity sporting events, attraction, theme parks, beaches, all of those things that make Florida so attractive is also attractive to those who are trying to do this disturbing criminal activity as well. We are joined today by Dennis Hanks of the Florida Alliance for Vacation Rentals, Ingrid Knudsen with Sunrise of Pasco County, which I work with them a lot, so it's good to see her on here, and Savannah Parvu, who's my friend, and also serves, I get the privilege of serving alongside her on the board of the Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking. I'm participating today specifically because as law enforcement who worked many years devoted to combating human trafficking, I have seen both the despicable side of how traffickers use the hospitality industry, but on an encouraging side, I've also seen the hospitality industry really take a front seat, front line, and say, we're not going to allow this in our industry. So there's going to be some things that we talk about here in just a moment that I think is going to be really critical. And I'm going to have the opportunity to kind of maybe share a couple of those experiences with you. But today is a powerful, powerful webinar. And I'm so glad that you took the time to join us today. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists kind of formally and special guests and say thank you to the Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking for hosting this event. First, I'm going to introduce Dennis Hanks, currently sits as the full-time Executive Director of the statewide Florida Alliance for Vacation Rentals, which is a 501c6 nonprofit hospitality trade association. Dennis has been leading the organization's efforts since 2014. The organization supports the $30 billion per year Florida vacation rental market and over 275,000 short-term rentals statewide. This alliance includes thousands of vacation rental owners, managers, major attraction, food service providers, online travel agents, national vacation rental industry vendors, and other partners. The Alliance is the largest vacation rental association in the United States, representing 26% of the entire U.S. vacation rental market. So Dennis, thank you for being here today and bringing your expertise to this discussion. Next, I'm going to introduce to you Ingrid Knudsen, is a domestic and sexual violence advocate at Sunrise of Pasco in Newport Richey, Florida. This position includes crisis counseling, court advocacy, safety planning, sexual assault forensic exam accompaniment, and introducing survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking to other resources in the area. Using an empowerment model, Sunrise of Pasco is made up of two major areas: intervention and prevention. The intervention team is made up of advocates who help participants set their own goals and then plan with them to help reach those goals. The prevention team focuses on training in the community through schools, law enforcement, and various healthcare providers. And again, we're so glad to have Ingrid with us today to lend her expertise to this discussion. And then my friend Savannah Parvu has a passion for writing and speaking about the hope she has found after many years of abuse. Taking just a moment to say a big thank you to Savannah for being here. She has lived experience, and of everyone on this panel, she is absolutely the most qualified to speak to this particular issue. She routinely shares her experience with the public to grow knowledge of the tragic issue of familial trafficking within the commercial sex trafficking arena. She is a nationally recognized speaker on the subject and has won awards from anti-human trafficking organizations for her efforts. And as your facilitator, I want you to know that we are all interested in your comments and your questions. So if you have questions, please submit those in the chat. You're welcome to submit those. And Aaron Collins, in fact, we elicit those. We want you to ask those questions in the chat. Aaron Collins, who you met just earlier with the Florida Alliance, will be monitoring the chat for me and will alert me when questions come in so that I can work them into the conversation. So be involved, be engaged. We want this to be an engaging webinar, not just one where we're simply talking at you, but we're talking together about this issue. In fact, many of you that are on this call have absolute direct knowledge of this issue, and we'd love to hear from you as well. So I'm going to begin today by talking about human trafficking. As all of you on this call, or probably all of you on this call know, human trafficking has been referred to as modern day slavery or a form of modern day slavery. It involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain labor or commercial sex. Every year, millions of men, women, and children are trafficked in countries around the world, including the United States. And we know those statistics are very broad, and there's a lot of statistics out there. But just know that thousands upon thousands, in fact, millions, are involved in this, both from the trafficking side and the buyer side. So you have traffickers, you have those that are victims, and you have the buyers, and there are millions that are participating in this illicit activity. So here's what we're going to talk about, these different types. There's sex trafficking. Victims of sex trafficking are manipulated or forced to engage in sex acts for someone's commercial gain. Sex trafficking is not prostitution. Anyone under the age of 18 engaging in commercial sex is considered to be a victim of human trafficking. And as law enforcement, we do not have to prove the elements of force, fraud, or coercion. They are a victim, period. So we want you to consider that as part of the equation as well. No exceptions. Forced labor. Victims of forced labor are compelled to work for little or no pay, often manufacturing or growing the products we use and consume every day. Landscaping, house cleaning, house keeping, there's construction trades. All of those have a large propensity to draw in the forced labor side. And then we have domestic servitude. Victims of domestic servitude are forced to work in isolation and are hidden in plain sight as nannies, housekeepers, or domestic help. Many states now roll domestic servitude kind of into the forced labor side as well. But those are what we consider the three major forms of human trafficking, though there are many. So those are the three we're going to kind of highlight today. As we begin, I'd really like to take this opportunity to ask the first question to Savannah. First of all, Savannah was very active in helping to get that legislation we spoke about, legislation passed up at Capitol Hill. She has been a strong advocate of really bringing training and awareness into the hospitality industry. So I want to start with you, Savannah, asking you why, the why of why you took it upon yourself, along with many others, but you really were one of the leaders in this effort to really get this awareness training into the hospitality industry. So give us the why.
The reason why I was so persistent on getting the legislation passed is because it would have helped me when I was younger. I grew up with parents that were alcoholics and drug addicts, and my mom was prostituting herself when I was 11 years old. And there was a time when I went with her, and her drug dealer offered her a $10 piece of crack for me instead of for her. And that is when I began being sold on a regular basis by her drug dealer. And so he would take me and he would sell me at different houses, but a lot of times I was sold out of hotels in Central Florida. And there was one hotel in particular that we went to on a regular basis, and the staff actually assisted my trafficker in selling me by letting him leave me there, and he arranged with them to let people in the room so that he didn't have to stay there. And if somebody had helped me then when I was 11, I wouldn't have continued being trafficked as long as I was. And so it became important for me that hotels know what's going on and train their staff to recognize it and to report it, because it could have helped me get out of the situation when I was a lot younger than when I was 26, which was the last time I was trafficked.
I've heard you tell the story many times, and every time it's heart wrenching. Is there any time in particular during that timeline of exploitation where there are moments of opportunities for someone to intervene and maybe stop that trafficking?
Yes, there was a lot of times when I was in contact with not only just the staff at the hotel, but also people staying at the hotel. But there was one time that stands out the most for me, and that was I was about 12 years old. I had been at the hotel for a couple of days because I never knew how long I was going to be there. And at one day, the staff came in and told me that my friend called, who was really my trafficker, and said that I could walk home because I was done. And so I was walking through the hall of the hotel, and I was crying, I was bleeding, I had bruises on me, didn't have any shoes on, and nobody asked any questions about what happened to me or if I was okay or if I needed help. They just told me to walk home.
Yeah, and Dennis, I know both of us listening, that all of us on this call hearing this, we sometimes go back to opportunities that just in our professional careers or even our personal lives where events like this, how many times has these been missed? And I think it leads us to kind of that next question. And in your role as leading a statewide organization and whose members are now required to complete an annual awareness training on human trafficking, what's been the feedback from members of your organization about this new law? And then second part of that question is, why has it been so important to you that your organization and those you represent are so proactive on this issue?
Well, thank you, Ellen. It's good to be part of this conversation today. We've had a lot of legislation we've tracked over the years, and this being one of those that we tracked. And I don't think that there was ever anybody that said, this is something we would be opposed to as an industry. This is one of those things where everybody kind of dove right in. They said, this makes sense to do. While you probably don't hear of it a lot in our industry, everybody always centers around it's got to be in the hotels. There's that little bit of denial, I guess, that it would be happening in your industry. But being part of the DBPR, which is the licensing authority for vacation rentals, we've been working very closely with them on this legislation when it rolled out to get people more involved. We immediately went into the training that the Florida Alliance provides and have given that to all of our members across the state of Florida. So for us, it totally made sense. And there was never a pushback on it. But I think what we've seen so far is people that have taken the training, it's that new awareness for them. It's kind of that awakening where they're like, wow, this could have happened at this point in time in one of my homes or one of my rentals. And I didn't even know it because I didn't recognize those signs. And now I think that's just brought to light so many things that they can take advantage of and make sure they're helping to stop this in its tracks.
Do you have any feedback from maybe some of the members of any instances where they kind of, like you said, the light bulb went on and they recognized that this could be happening, or they maybe stopped something from happening, or at least had a suspicion? Has there been any kind of translation?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because not long after we were required to take this training, I did it myself, and I'm not an operator, but it was just unique for me to take it. Some of our board members had taken the course, and one operator, they only own a couple of homes, and they had taken the course probably several weeks after taking the course. The interesting thing with our industry is because it's kind of remote check-in and things of that nature, a lot of people are using Ring doorbells and things now to see what's going on in the home and who's coming in and out. And these people noticed that there was a check-in scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The people didn't show up to check in. And they ended up checking in at 2 a.m. in the morning with a van full of folks that they didn't have registered during that check-in. And it just kind of rang a bell like, wow, what's going on here? There's less adults than they were supposed to have. There's more kids and things coming into the home. So the next morning, this property manager said to the guests, they said, hey, we noticed you checked in at 2 a.m. and you got more people in your party. What's going on? Well, within a matter of an hour or two, they just disappeared. They never came back for a weekly rental. They just packed up and left. So automatically it was like, wow, what was going on there that we've triggered some type of questions here? And I think that's the awareness factors. Taking the course and then just knowing those warning signs when you should react is so key to everything in stopping this.
Well, thank you for that, Dennis. And I think that's so important because I cannot stress from a law enforcement perspective, I cannot stress when you look at trying to both detect and then disrupt the human trafficking activity, how important it is to capture those exposure points. Because the exposure point in this activity are oftentimes little brief snapshots. I think that's why it's so important that check-in staff and cleaning staff and maintenance staff, those that may have a view when others may not be seeing what's going on behind that closed door or inside that rental property or whatever property that may be. So having those exposure points and having the ability to have trained observers in those exposure points is so critical. So thank you for that perspective and letting us know, kind of raising awareness. And the next thing you know, you see a difference being made. So I think that's fantastic. Ingrid, I'm going to swing over to you a little bit with the service provider side. We know that service providers are an integral part of our communities. And with an increased focus on awareness in the hospitality industry, what are you and Sunrise of Pasco doing to facilitate these collaborative discussions and really bring both the intervention side, but also the prevention side?
Yeah, so right now we're in the process of creating more training specialized to the needs of those receiving the trainings, such as the hospitality industry specifically. So if there's like a hotel or an organization or anything else that needs a very specific training need, we have an incredible prevention team that would be more than happy to tailor something specifically for them. We also recently created new human trafficking self-identification posters, and they're translated into English, simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese, and Vietnamese, because we know that language barriers can definitely inhibit utilizing services. So we try to make ourselves as accessible as we can. We're also currently working with Pasco County buses to get posters, the self-identification posters, onto each bus and bus shelter where people wait to get on the bus. And we would absolutely love to give more trainings to hotels in our area or distribute our posters throughout the hospitality industry and continue to grow awareness in our county. We have a lot of DV and SV survivors that come to us and say, I had no idea that you guys were here, or I had no idea that these services even existed. And we have like a really strong online presence, and we do a lot of community events in person. And throughout COVID, we did a lot of Zoom presentations as well. But when people are isolated, like many trafficking survivors are, the topic of our services is very intentionally left out of the conversation. We have a wonderful group of counselors, we have a shelter, a 24/7 hotline, and other services ready for whoever needs us. And we're not a unique entity in this way. There are shelters, organizations, service providers all across Florida that often go unnoticed. There is help. There are people like Sunrise to go alongside survivors wherever they're at in their journey. There are news stories, pieces of news like Elon Musk buying most of Twitter or Johnny Depp and his wife in court. Like, you can't not hear about it, even if you're trying not to. So one day I hope that the knowledge of our services is going to be this type of news, that the community at large, that it's so overwhelmingly known, even with intentional blindness, the community can't help but see these services. And I think having a continued conversation with the hospitality industry could definitely benefit that goal.
So just so that those that are on the call are aware as well, what does it kind of look like when a potential victim, somebody who's been recovered, a survivor, when they come into services, what does it kind of look like from a service provider, and what kind of resources can they be connected to? What type of resources?
So internally, we have, of course, our shelter, and then we have individual counseling. So survivors will be linked with an advocate or a case manager if they're in shelter, and we're able to connect them to different resources in our area, such as long-term housing, trying to get them set up there or with a job, things like that. But internally, we have support groups, individual counseling, we have advocacy, court advocacy. So we really try to tailor it and make it as specialized to the survivor as possible, as much as they need or as little as they need. Again, we're an empowerment-based agency, so it's really up to them how much or how little that we're involved in whatever they need.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think one of the things that we wanted to really cover in this particular segment of questions before we move on to the other was the forms of human trafficking. And Dennis, I'll come up to you real quick on this and ask you, from an organizational standpoint and those members and managers and operators that you represent, do you see the possibility, and does it differ a little bit, the possibility of both a commercial sex trafficking component within the hospitality industry, and do you also feel like there may be a forced labor component that may try to take advantage of hospitality?
Yeah, I think that there's probably both of those. In our industry, we operate so differently than your typical hospitality because we're really homes in residential communities. There are a lot of eyes on the homes as well, the neighbors and others that are around these homes that tend to be very vocal in watching what's going on. But I think there's still an opportunity, not even just with our industry folks that are employees, but also the fact that there's a lot of subcontractors involved in what we do from our hospitality segment. And they're working for cleaning companies, they're working for contractors and others that are working on all these properties in communities. So I think that opens up a whole new door of things. And, with this legislation, it's really mandated that the employees are trained, but also there's so much more out there as far as the contractor side that is kind of left up in the air and not really involved in any of this.
Yeah, and that raises a real flag as well, and that is downstream contractors, and how do we kind of get them into the fold as well? Because that training is a must, in my opinion. That training is a must for everyone that's involved in the entire spectrum, contractors and employees as well. I'm going to move kind of into a second segment, which I think is really critical. So we touched on it briefly, but I really want to kind of drill down to this. Traffickers often take advantage of the privacy and the anonymity that's accessible through the hospitality industry. The hotel, a motel, a vacation rental can be especially attractive locations for all forms of human trafficking. We know that human trafficking occurs at sporting events, it's at theme parks, cruise ships, and many other areas in the tourism industry. But what I'd really like to do is talk for just a minute about how that anonymity can kind of play into that, how that privacy and the role that training has to kind of strip back a little bit of that anonymity as well. We talked a little bit about that, about the importance of kind of that frontline exposure points, as I called it. Dennis, to you first. Hospitality employees are often in the best position to see potential signs of human trafficking, especially since their duties give them access to different areas of the properties. They might also have direct or indirect contact with both the trafficker and with victims. what are the members, your members sharing about their operational processes since completing the awareness training? And has anything changed about how they go about their duties in business, and what kind of proactive measures are involved?
That's a good question. I mean, everything has changed since COVID, and it's changed for the good, the bad. You look at different aspects of the hospitality industry, and whether you're in the hotel industry, motels, bed and breakfast, whatever, a lot has changed because now people are going towards a remote check-in. There's no face-to-face contact because of COVID. So now sometimes people are just sent a code. They show up to a house, they punch their code in, they walk in, they never see a person. And we've relied a lot on technology in our industry now, as I mentioned earlier, the Ring doorbells and other types of devices that we can use to kind of monitor remotely. So that's changed everything with COVID. We're seeing more and more folks that are using that technology in every aspect of their business. And now we're kind of seeing a shift back to the face-to-face type meetings, because what we started seeing during the COVID era is there were parties going on because these guys are smart. Anyone who's dealing in, really, criminal activity or whatever it may be, they're actually figuring out ways around these things. They're saying, well, nobody's going to meet me at that house to give me a set of keys, so I can really just walk in and do whatever I want. And we see people filing in and 10, 20 people in a home. So it's always incumbent upon our operators to really get more involved in being aware of what's going on, aware of what might happen. So it's in the sharing economy, everything has changed, but COVID has even emphasized that even more, that you really have to be aware of what's going on in every aspect of operations.
Yeah, and taking, Dennis, staying with you for just a moment, taking kind of stripping away the mandated part of it, just the value of having training on properties like this. What would you say to someone who may be reluctant, maybe somebody that's not in Florida, that may be on this call, that they don't have a mandate? What would you say to them about the value of taking the training, whether there's a mandate or not, simply for the human value of that training? What would you say to them?
Well, and that's one thing that when we do a lot of the compliance type training with our members, they'll say, hey, the legislation says that just my employees have to take it. And I said, well, how often do your employees see guests? We go through that whole process of asking those questions, and they'll say, well, it's usually my landscaper that's, meets guests. They bump into them while they're there in the home. And we're like, well, why aren't you asking that contractor to be taking the course, becoming more aware of what's going on? Because as I mentioned, we're dependent upon a lot of contractors. They're always around the homes. They're in these communities. Sometimes they're working on multiple homes. And I mean, it could even be in a hotel setting or another type of hospitality. Somebody's washing a window on the 5th floor of a hotel, and they see something going on in a parking lot or whatever. Though the awareness, even though they're a contractor, they should be aware of all those surroundings and what's happening. And I think that's what's the most important thing that we can relay to our members that have to take the training. Also ask your contractors to take it, even though they're not mandated, because it's so important to have that network of people that are always watching and always reporting. If you see something, say something, and just bring it to light. It may not be anything.
Yeah, that's valuable. So thank you for kind of voicing that. I think that's important. Ingrid, over to you. How would you work and counsel an individual who may have witnessed or even experienced an exploitive act, and they don't really want to come forward to report it? What would you say to them? What kind of advice could you give to someone who maybe has witnessed or experienced that type of act?
So if this was like someone calling me on the hotline, or like somebody that came up and talked to me after an awareness event, like the first thing I would do is just wait for them to explain the situation to the best of their ability, probably ask a few clarifying questions, and then I would usually thank them for telling me and for explaining the situation to me. And I would validate their feelings at that time, because if they experienced it, or even if they just saw it, that they can be very anxious, or scared, or confused. If they were panicking or having like a trauma response, I might go through some breathing or grounding exercises, just something to take care of them. And sometimes someone in that situation just needs another human being to say, yeah, that does sound odd. And it definitely is raising some red flags for human trafficking. And after that, they may be more willing or wanting to report. After their immediate needs were taken care of, I would usually talk about options. The person calling could report this anonymously to the police, and then they don't need to be further involved. As an advocate, I could report it on their behalf, or I could be on the phone with them when they report it. If they're talking about trafficking in another county or in another state, we can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline together and find out where the closest anti-trafficking organization is to them to get them best integrated with the most useful services. I would try to stick with our empowerment model of advocacy and let them know that this is their decision. However, if they're telling me about a minor, so someone being trafficked who's under 18, I do have to let them know that I'm a mandated reporter and I will have to do a child abuse report within 24 hours. But in the end, my main goal would be to validate their feelings and give them options, explain the process to the best of my ability so that they can make an informed decision and demystify anything that may seem confusing or unknown. Because one of the biggest barriers is just, fear of doing something wrong, looking stupid, looking like you didn't know the signs of trafficking, or you're making a bigger deal than what it is, or you're making more work for other people. But if someone calls the hotline and they explain a situation that is not trafficking, the worst that can happen is we say, okay, that's not what that is. And then we part our ways and it's okay. And you're not wasting anybody's time.
Yeah, so one of the other questions that I would ask very quickly, and I know we probably have some questions that are being asked by the audience. We want to get to those in just a moment. But while we're still on that topic, the role of trauma that's involved, and we know that trauma is very persistent inside the world of trafficking. So when we're looking at trauma and we're looking at how do we address trauma, what would be the thing that you would mention that is so important in starting to deal with that stabilization of that victim when it comes to trauma?
I mean, it's different for each person what really stabilizes them. I think a lot of our go-to on hotlines is doing breathing exercises or doing some visualization techniques. So there are some breathing exercises like 4, 4, and 4. So breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4. And honestly, just doing that with the person on the hotline call, just breathing with them, breathing with another human being. It's a very human moment and can really help ground somebody. Or going through visualization techniques, what are your 5 senses? Go through each of your 5 senses. Because when you're having a trauma response, you feel like you're in danger. Your brain is doing that thing that it does when you're in danger, to go in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And it thinks that it's in danger when you're not. And it's just kind of getting you out of your head and into your body, into the space that you're in, and kind of just going through that and reminding them, okay, you're safe, and giving them the time and the space to feel that. We don't need to rush to calling the police. We don't need to rush to making decisions. We don't need to rush unless there's immediate danger and 911 needs to be called. Like, it's okay to take a little bit of time to just ground yourself, to give yourself that time and space. And I think kind of reinforcing that idea that we don't have to get everything done right now. We can just kind of take care of you, and then later we can figure out what to do about the situation. That can help a lot of people to just give themselves that time and that space.
Thank you for that. I think that's important. Aaron, we may have some questions from the audience, and we'll catch up on those.
Sounds good. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, everyone. Ruby Peters asked, and you might have, this question is for you, Ingrid. You sort of addressed it earlier, but are you able to share any of the self-identifying materials? She does human trafficking education for Catholic Charities in Jacksonville, and would love to share any info. I'll let you answer that question, but I'll also tell everyone that we will be sharing all of our panelists' contact information or their websites, whatever they prefer. So if you have follow-up questions or want additional resources or materials from them, you can get those afterwards. So Ingrid, I don't know if you wanted to tackle that question.
Yeah, so I'm definitely able to give those out. They do have our hotline number and our logo on it. So if you're doing it specifically for your organization or for your specific area, you might want to put in either the National Human Trafficking Hotline or something that's a little closer to you, just because ours is located within Pasco. And so like those would be those only 2 changes. But aside from that, I can definitely hand those to you. Yeah.
Awesome. The other question came from Jane, and I saw that it was answered, but she was asking if there's a statewide directory where she can see Florida counties and the different organizations that exist. Yes, I will post the link to the Florida Attorney General's website, which lists all the task forces, the local task forces throughout the state, along with the lead or head of that task force and their contact information. And that would be a great way to find out the service providers and advocates in your area.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. Is there any other questions for us?
I just had one more question come in. Someone wants to know, and this is for anyone, share the role that state parks might play within kind of the human trafficking arena. So I don't know who wants to tackle that first. Alan, if you want to share your thoughts on how state parks might come into play into a trafficking situation.
Sure, absolutely. So I can tell you from, again, coming at it from more of a law enforcement perspective, one of the things that we really were concerned with, and I'll put it in those terms, I was going to say feared, but we were concerned with like Super Bowls coming to Florida, large scale events, whatever the case may be, is we have mandated training now, as you've heard, to mandate hotels, motels, rental properties, things of that nature. Dennis talked about at length earlier, but one of the things that we really started concerning ourselves, because we started hearing this and we started hearing the chatter, that is it going to move from short-term rentals or hotels and motels who have trained observers on the property that are now mandated by legislation, will it move to other areas? And some of those areas that we were very concerned about were RV parks. Would they start setting up mobile brothels in an RV park? Would they bring down a stable, and kind of using the industry term, but would they bring down victims of human trafficking from other areas and bring them down in an RV, park them at an RV park and move them around so that it became very difficult to detect? What about marinas, where you can actually get on a large boat and cast offshore and operate maybe a brothel or quote unquote a party boat out? So those became concerning. But one of the areas, and this goes to the answering the question now, is even in the state parks. A lot of the state parks have camping facilities inside the state park. They have, some of them even have rentals inside there. And so moving into those areas, because those are very isolated, moving into those areas where they can be undetected for large portions of time and rarely running into someone else. So that's where the concern with a state park would come. But I can also tell you that there are some short-term, short duration activities that can happen in parks as well that can go off site, go down a trail, activity happens, and then they come out from those parks. So that's where that would come from, is kind of moving it from some of those areas that we think about when we think about human trafficking, how it can happen, to some of those locations that may not be top of mind. And again, RV parks, marinas, state parks would be another place as well. So that would be the concern initially. And somebody else may have another thing to add to that as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, Alan, it's, we're seeing with the sharing economy now, the whole entire hospitality industry has changed. And when you mention boats and campers and other things, those are on sites everywhere where there's platforms that cater to people that are looking for those unique types of hospitality things. So I think it opens up the door for, almost any type of activity like that. You can go on some sites now and you can rent a boat for the weekend. You can rent a trailer in someone's backyard. There's just so many opportunities for people to rent those things in the sharing economy that it does open up a whole new set of challenges of kind of monitoring and what's going on in those. But it is a licensed activity, and it is done and licensed by the state. So we're just hoping that those folks that are active in those different types of lodging are going to get the training and things they need also to be part of this.
And I think that's so important, Dennis, you bring that up, is that while there may be some licensing issues, what I have found, again, just through the years of working, what I have found is that anytime you have a regulatory industry, you also have a black market that begins to operate. And I think that those are the concerns. But what's important about the training side of this is when trained operators in this industry, they have a tendency to really expose those who are operating shady or unlicensed or something like that. So this training and being trained is critical as well. So I think that's so important to recognize.
Yeah, and even, there are a lot of transition of former hotels and motels and other things that are now basically getting into almost like an affordable housing setting. So they may come out of that hospitality type of unit and be more of a longer term affordable housing type option. And, there could be other things going on in there as well. So the whole industry is constantly churning and you're seeing new things happening. So it's always good to get as many people aware of this situation as possible.
Yeah, and Savannah, I want to kind of work you into this conversation as well, because this is so critical. You shared your story with us today and talked a little bit about, the activity and some of the circumstances surrounding your story, which is so valuable for us to hear. I wanted to ask, what signs or indicators should people within the hospitality industry look out for with regards to potential human trafficking situations? Are there particular things that should be top of mind in the hospitality industry?
Yeah, there's several things that can be looked for depending on if it's a hotel or Airbnb. As Dennis mentioned, the Ring cameras for the rental homes is great. In Pasco County, they just caught the murder suspects on the Ring doorbells for Airbnb. But that could be used to see multiple people coming into a rental house, or even the instance that he gave with the people arriving late with a bunch of minors and less adults and stuff. That can be picked up on there. But in hotels, it could be minors, a lot of people in a room, or one person running multiple rooms. And then it could also be minors staying in the rooms by themselves for long periods of time. I know when I was being trafficked, I was the only minor there, but then there were multiple people coming into the room. So I know that traffic had to have been seen. Talking to somebody who you might think is a victim and they appear fearful or anxious, or if they're with somebody else, that person answering the questions for them. Refusing cleaning services for multiple days in a row. Those can be some of the indicators.
Yeah, and is there anything, again, just kind of through that lived experience, is there anything that comes front of mind to you as well that that maybe a change in operation may have made a difference, or is there a way to kind of proactively begin to kind of disrupt the activity as well? Is there anything that comes to mind in that area as well?
There's so many things that could, I think some things have been changed from when I was trafficked to now, but I think we still have a long way to go. But I mean, I'm not really sure how much it's changed.
Yeah, and I think maybe Dennis, that would be a question that could come to you as well. What are some of the changes, and we talked about this earlier in the question, but changes in processes that you think proactively disrupt that?
I think it comes down to the use of the technology, which is so important. I mean, the technology changes in our industry now have gone so crazy over the last probably 5 years. I mean, we even have the ability now with noise monitoring in homes to tell how many people are in the home, how many people are in the home on the basis of how they're using their Wi-Fi. Are there 6 devices connected and so on? And we've seen, all throughout COVID, when things were shut down here and there, folks who were coming not necessarily from in-state and doing this suspicious activity, but they were coming from out of state into Florida and performing some of this. So the monitoring devices, use of technology, just the intuition of the people that may be talking on the phone to someone, understanding what the conversation is when you start getting into the reservation aspect. All of those people really play into this whole part, and just raising that awareness too. I know that just from our very proactive outreach in this, we've had all kinds of different folks from outside of Florida say, why did Florida do this? Why did they institute this? How can we institute it in our areas? We did a podcast with a person from Australia, and they were like, this is such a heavy issue, but it's got to be talked about. And I think just getting that conversation going is so important.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I've had some folks reach out to me from other states as well and talk about how Florida has taken the lead in this, and how good this particular training and getting it into the hospitality industry is. So there certainly is a recognition that Florida is kind of on the leading edge of some of this type of legislation. So it's fantastic. Ingrid, you had mentioned earlier some indicators that you guys put together. Are there anything else, kind of indicators that you can think of to kind of add to the conversation we just had about what to look for?
I mean, specifically in the hospitality industry, like if people are coming and checking in without a lot of luggage, especially if they're staying for an extended period of time, but they don't have luggage, or if, they just have luggage in like a paper bag or something, like something that just seems a little bit off. And again, I encourage calling a hotline, because hotline sounds really scary, but it's not. We have people that call our hotline to ask us our address to our thrift store. Like it's, it doesn't have to be like a crisis situation to call us. So if you just want to like talk about something, say, this sounds a little weird. Am I right to think this is weird? Like we're perfectly, we're here for that. We're here to listen. And, kind of on the flip side of what Savannah was saying, where if people are refusing, turn down service, to be able, also when people start asking for a lot of towels, if people are asking for more towels, more changes, just quantities of things that are either a lot less or a lot more than what people would normally be asking. Again, it's just kind of a bit of a red flag.
Yeah, and Dennis, one more, just kind of a follow up to what you had mentioned earlier, and that is looking at the technology. And you mentioned that technology is really taking kind of a center stage in the industry. What are maybe some of the emerging trends you're seeing? Emerging trends such as digital currencies, any of those kind of things that are maybe kind of out just a little ways in front of us yet, that maybe you see that we can maybe get ahead of and take a look at and bring it into account?
Not as much on the currency side of things. A lot of the folks that book with us are usually booking online. There's just tens of thousands of properties online, so people are booking remotely. The booking window has shrunk. So something that might have red flagged earlier was, hey, I'm just going to use Orlando for an instance. I want to go to Orlando and it's 2 days before I'm supposed to be there. I want to book your home. That was a red flag at one time, but post-COVID, it's not. The booking window has shrunk. So now it's kind of removed those instances. One fun fact, I guess, is we've heard from our tourism folks at the rest areas. And even pre-COVID, 50% of the people that show up at one of those tourist information centers still don't know where they're going to stay. So it's really interesting, the dynamics and what goes on in the travel and tourism industry. People just automatically think, let's go to Florida, and they drive in and then they figure out where they're going to stay afterwards. It's not my kind of travel planning, but it does happen, I guess. But all of these things that have changed, even background checks now, with the COVID era, we had a lot of parties and things happening in hotels, motels, vacation rentals. We're still seeing some of those, but now the technology of background checks, scanning through someone's social media accounts and things before they say, hey, we don't want you in our home, or we're not going to accept your booking. That's really commonplace right now. A lot of folks don't want to pay for the subscription service for it, but it's so key to targeting some of this stuff, even for people that are just going to trash your home. So those things are all becoming really prevalent in the industry now. It's very hard because in some cases you can't track a person's background, particularly if they're coming internationally. You can only check it domestically. But there's just, like I say, so many advances in the industry now, and in ways that people can really figure out what's going to happen in their property.
Well, I think, in the year, and we're going to kind of move into another segment here, but one of the things that just in the years of kind of the work that I've done on the street when it comes to some of these, I have people ask me all the time, say, well, what about that hotel or that motel or that property that just won't do it? Obviously it's mandated in Florida now, but they just won't do it. They don't participate. They don't take it serious. It's just a check the box type of activity. And I know DBPR has kind of an enforcement component to this, to making sure that happens. But to those who say, I'm just going to check a box, my response to that has always been one of the values, and we've talked, all of you on the panel have talked about the value of being trained. The trained observer in those exposure points is critically important. One of the other values that sometimes is not thought about is that when you can actually see what properties don't really want to do this, they don't want to do the training. It's just to check the box. That in itself, to me at least, in my work, kind of became a red flag. Why? Why was something this important, an issue this important? Why wouldn't you take it? And it becomes kind of a place that I'm going to dedicate a few resources to because of that. So I think that there's a lot of value to taking a look at this and kind of setting that standard. What does that standard look like? Training to that standard and making sure that there is that awareness piece. Savannah, you talked about it, and we're so grateful for your candor and openness today. And you shared your story. You talked about your lived experience and shared with us a little bit of the things that kind of came to top of mind during your experience. I wanted to ask you if an owner of a hotel or a vacation rental that thinks that awareness training is just not important. We kind of talked about it a moment. It's kind of just to check the box. It's maybe a waste of time. And I don't think there's many, and I'm thankful for that. But maybe that one or two that's out there, that few, that handful that says this is just a waste of time. It's just to check the box. Why is this important to you? What would be your personal message to that owner or that operator about why this is so important?
Yeah, I would say that this is important to me because I was in the situation where I was being trafficked at a hotel. And I know that, I know at least one person knew what was happening, but I know other people saw me, and maybe they didn't know it was human trafficking because human trafficking didn't technically exist then. It wasn't a term, but they knew that something was happening that shouldn't be happening. And I feel like if somebody knew what was happening or how to recognize it, they were trained, that when I was 11 years old, I could have stopped being trafficked when I was 11 and not when I was 26. And I wouldn't have had as much trauma as I've had and have to heal as many areas, and I wouldn't have the physical impacts that it's had on me. And I feel like this training should be, if you care about people, this training should be just as important as any other type of training or maintenance or anything else you do, because this training can save lives.
Yeah, and Savannah, you made such a critically important point that right before I go to Ingrid to talk to her about another aspect of this, I've had the opportunity to do some training with Sunrise, and I'm very thankful for that. It's a great organization. Savannah and I have done some trainings together, provided some trainings together for some task forces and things across the state, and always thankful for that. It's an amazing opportunity. But when I think about training and prevention and awareness, it really comes to mind about how important that is. When I worked with human trafficking prevention, and I've done some things on task forces, one of the things that I think is important for people to realize is that human trafficking is kind of we call it modern day slavery, but it's kind of that hidden crime, it's called, but it really is a world unto itself. It has a subculture to it. It has a language. That language is very specific to that activity. When they say a particular phrase, it may mean one thing to quote the normal world, but inside that trafficking world, it has a whole different meaning. And if we're not trained how to, and we don't have to be trained on every term. I personally put together a glossary of sex trafficking terms. That glossary has over 240 words, 240 words that are English words, but they have a specific meaning in the world of sex trafficking. It's a glossary of terms. We know that they have symbols inside of human trafficking. Sometimes we call it branding, but there's both the hard branding, there's now soft branding that we're seeing a lot, especially with minors that are involved in sex trafficking. So you have hard branding and soft branding. That's what training can do. It can bring that level of awareness. So as what Savannah just said just a moment ago, so that when that situation happens, and it happens very quickly, and it happens sometimes very briefly, that trained observer knows what it is that they're seeing, or at least have a red flag or suspicion, and then have the ability to do something, as Dennis said, and Ingrid has said, and Savannah has mentioned as well, not just seeing it, not just observing it, but training allows us to have the resources to be able to respond and do something about that, make the call, make the report. And I think that's so critically important. Ingrid, you had mentioned just a few minutes ago, you had mentioned some of the work that Sunrise does. And like I said, I've had the privilege of working along Sunrise on some projects, and I know how valued they are in our community. But talk a little bit about the prevention team. How important is prevention in this? And I'm going to ask this to all of you, so just get aware, and it may not be on the script, but I want to ask you about prevention and the role of prevention. But talk about the prevention team a little bit for Sunrise and kind of what it does.
Yeah, so our prevention team does a wide variety of trainings, and they work really closely with our sexual assault program, and they also work directly on a local campus. So some of the sexual assault awareness trainings they have include red and green flags in relationships, teen dating violence, stalking prevention, being good bystanders, serving the LGBTQIA+ community, healthy relationships, social media safety, and one that actually I'm working on with them is how gender impacts consent, specifically focusing on masculinity. And then we've also recently developed a human trafficking 101 training that will be used for the first time this summer with a community partner. And then we have an internal mini training that focuses on human trafficking and illicit massage businesses. Prevention is so important, and it goes hand in hand with awareness, because trafficking is so misunderstood in our community, and in the community at large. It's thought of as a very different system than what is actually happening. And because of that, if people do see the signs, it's often missed, it's often overlooked. So going out and doing prevention, yes, it aids in preventing it from happening. It also just gets that awareness out there so that people know what they're looking at. So it can, there can be, secondary services and tertiary services that will come out of prevention work as well, just by getting the awareness of what actually is happening, what it actually looks like, and what are the systems to, assist survivors in what they need at whatever given time they're able to be contacted.
So to talk about prevention for just a moment, and to just kind of stay there for a minute, Dennis, to you, the role of prevention, getting to the prevention side, we oftentimes talk about intervention. We talk about, post-event. So the human trafficking event happens. We have what we talked about earlier. We have the trauma. We have the criminal activities. We have, the arrest, the prosecutions. We have all of those dynamics happen kind of post-event. So the activity happens, and then there's this post-world or post-timeline to that. What about getting on the front side of that? What about the role of prevention, and how important is that? And what does it look like?
That's a good question too, because where our industry, the vacation rental industry and hosting, as they call it, with different platforms, is so different than your traditional lodging. You've got your bricks and mortar hotels and motels where people check in at the desk, and we've talked a little bit about the remote check-in and things. But if you look at the structure of how the vacation rentals are held in the sharing economy, I know we have some of our members on that are professional vacation rental management companies. So they don't own the homes, they manage them on behalf of the owners. But then now you've got this larger segment in Florida, particularly. Joe and Mary from Ohio, they love to go to Florida every year. So they buy a second home in Florida. And now they're saying, hey, we've got a mortgage on this property and we only use it for 1 month. What do I do for those other 11 months? So they rent it out. And they're sometimes using a professional property manager, and then sometimes they don't. The realtor says, hey, I know Joe down the street and he does lawn care. And I know Charlie who does, he'll come in and clean the home. So they've got all these people going in and out all the time, but there's a lack of oversight. And those people that have the one home, the two home, they try to manage it remotely. That becomes a real tough situation for us to get them into the fold, to understand how to be licensed, to understand human trafficking, the awareness of it. All of those things, when you're trying to manage it from another state, becomes a really complex thing. And in the state of Florida, 75% of all the vacation rentals in Florida are people that have 5 or less homes. So it's not those professional managers that are boots on the ground in the community, managing the homes and in and out every day. It's some of those folks that are just having that second home and they're trying to manage it. So we have a real challenge getting to those people. We've actually changed the entire way we're structured as an association to let those people in, and at a very minimal cost, because we want them in so we can train them and get them into these programs like the human trafficking awareness, and just knowing that there's a structure behind everything we do to make them as professional as possible too, even though they have 1 or 2 homes. So getting way out in front of it like that and getting those people involved early on is so important. It's not that they don't want to take the training or they're trying to skirt the laws. They just don't know that it exists because they're in Ohio or Michigan or wherever else. So it's a really big challenge to get those people in part of, what we're doing.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, that sometimes it is the out of state. They don't live in state, and yet they have these properties that they're managing or they're renting, and the processes sometimes that happen there, the challenges that happen there. How important are things like signage, things like decals, things of that nature? Is there any value to, we talk about the training side, getting training, which I think is critically important, but what about visibly, because we talked about signage a moment ago. I think Ingrid mentioned some signage on buses. What about even signages within rentals, within hotels, having that type of visible? Is there an upside to it, and is there a downside? I know the downside is that sometimes somebody may perceive I have a problem with that. So what are the pros and cons of things of that nature?
And there's one of those very high contested areas. People are like, well, I don't want signage in my home. The owners will tell the managers, don't put that signage on the wall of my home. Put it inside one of the closets, on the back of the closet door. I don't know, who's going to be aware of that. But then there's also sometimes like a guest book, where it's slid into the guest book, and if someone's looking for where they should order pizza, it's on one page, and the other page will be that type of awareness piece. Again, technology is starting to evolve, where we have these giant iPads on the wall. When someone comes in to check in a home, they have to click on the iPad to use it and check off the house rules, and it can have things on there as well. That's one of those areas where everybody has a different idea of where they should put signage, how they should use it. Should be electronic. Is it something that's sent out in advance of their arrivals? It's just kind of all over the map on those, but there's really no standard to it. I think it's kind of dictated by the owners and the managers.
Yeah, I know when I worked in crime prevention, some crime prevention things, you would have business owners that didn't want the sign in front of their business about lock your doors, because the feeling was that kind of indicated this was a problem area. So there was always a little bit of pushback to that. I love the idea that there's some creative ways though to get the information out there without necessarily a flashing neon light that this may be an issue. So I love the idea of how technology is coming in. I personally love the idea of signage, but I know there's some pushback sometimes on that. I love the idea of the message that Florida is just not going to tolerate that. I know our Attorney General has made that very clear, that this is just not going to be tolerated in the state of Florida. So I think these are critical moments that we can use. Savannah, to you, I know it was a question that we've talked about a little bit with Ingrid and Dennis, and it was kind of a question that I threw in just a little bit. And that is, what about the role of prevention? As a lived experience expert, a survivor who has really become your life's work. What does prevention look like, and what is the role of prevention in really ending human trafficking?
Well, I will say that not just prevention, but awareness and prevention has been very impactful in my life, because I didn't know that the things that happened to me were human trafficking until I went to a human trafficking awareness event and learned what human trafficking was. And so I'm a very big advocate of awareness and prevention, because that's when I was able to get help, is when I learned that I could talk about what happened to me and I wouldn't be the one in trouble like I was always told I would be if I told. And then even my experiences with speaking, when I speak and other people hear my story, it makes them realize that they may be in a different situation, but they can relate to my story, and they realize that what's happening to them is also human trafficking. I think the signage is great, but I think we have to have the right signage, because I had heard about human trafficking before this awareness day, but it was pictures of girls tied up or locked away. And so I didn't relate to that, because I was never like locked up. I was free to come and go most of the time. Like, I wasn't chained up or tied up or anything like the pictures that I saw. So I think as long as we have the right signage, it's very beneficial to help people who are being trafficked, who may not identify as being trafficked until they see that sign or read what human trafficking is.
Yeah, and you made a couple of very critical points, and I saw Ingrid shaking her head, because I think that resonates to those of us who have worked in kind of inside this world of anti-human trafficking. Is the fact that sometimes the pictures of somebody in chains or locked up on a wall, or the movie Taken or something of that nature, can kind of create this false look of what human trafficking. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. We all know that it does, but it's those are rare. Those are in the grand scheme of this. It's more the luring in and that manipulation and coercion and conditioning that happens. Ingrid, you want to speak to that for just a moment, because I saw you shaking your head. That's so important to recognize those traits as well as some of the other things that we look for.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that the movie Taken has kind of been thrown around a lot in anti-trafficking spheres as kind of a prime example of what not to do, what this doesn't look like. And of course, there are some extreme examples, there are things that happen like that, but similar with SV, stranger rape happens, but it's not the majority of the time. And that's what people often think of. And it's usually someone that someone that you're close to. And with human trafficking, it's often that you're not going to be tied up. There's force, fraud, or coercion. It can be fraud and coercion. It very much often is. And force can also be a mental force, an intellectual force that keeps people there. And so I often see signage and posters. I mean, if you look up human trafficking on Google, like the pictures will be like hands tied, or like somebody with a hand over their mouth, and it's not what it looks like, and it gets this picture in your head of what human trafficking is, and that makes such a big barrier, because self-identifying as a survivor of a crime, any type of crime, but especially something like human trafficking is difficult in and of itself. And then to be bombarded with images that don't look like the situation that you're in creates an even larger barrier. And it reinforces what a trafficker might tell you, that, this is normal, or this is your fault, or this is something that, you're choosing to do, or that you have to do for the family, or something like that. And it just reinforces those messages, because you don't connect this idea that it's human trafficking, because we have this different image of what trafficking is. And I remember I watched a movie a little while back. It was called Lovelace, and it was about a porn star, and it was under the understanding of domestic violence. So I was interested, and I watched it because she's a real person, Linda Lovelace, and she went off and spoke about domestic violence as she as she got out of the porn industry because of what her husband had been doing throughout that time. But as I was watching it, I was like, her husband is trafficking her. And that was what was going off in my mind. And I'll watch different movies and TV shows and be like, this looks like trafficking, but it's never called that. And then there will be something like the movie Taken, where we'll talk about human trafficking. And it's like, it doesn't really look like that. So there's that great divide of what it actually looks like to what media portrays it as. And it just creates a more difficult time for survivors to realize what's happening is human trafficking. What's happening is not their fault. You know, they are not alone. And it creates such a barrier for survivors. So yeah, getting those correct images out there, explaining what trafficking really is so vitally important.
Hey, Alan, I'm going to hop in here real quick. There was a question earlier for Ingrid about Sunrise's programs and asked if Sunrise provides housing. I'll let you answer that in 1 second. And then there was another question about human trafficking, the topic, is it included in the curriculum of Florida's public schools? And it is. I'll put the website for the Florida Department of Education in the chat. Each of the 67 counties school boards adopted age-appropriate curriculum based on a variety of factors set forth by the department. So yes, that is ongoing, and that was promulgated or put into the Department of Education rule back in 2019. And so I'll put that link to the various districts' curriculum in the chat. And then Ingrid, if you wanted to talk about if Sunrise has housing and any other programs that you want to highlight.
Yeah, so we have a shelter for survivors of domestic violence mainly, but it's also for survivors of sexual assault and human trafficking, which is really amazing because a lot of our sister shelters are specifically focused for DV, and that's their only qualification, which is understandable just given the community that we're in and grants and all of that. But we are able to take survivors of DV, SV, and HT on the spectrum of gender. We're able to take anybody. Usually in the physical shelter that we have, it has 40 beds. We take anyone who identifies as female and their children, but we are able to take men, those who identify as male, and anybody else outside of that binary or somewhere in between. We work with the hotel. Sometimes we're able to get people into the hotel for a stay there, or work with our sister shelters to be able to get someone over there. And yeah, I think that's yeah. So we do have shelter, we do have housing. It's a minimum of a 6-week stay. We are able to extend that, of course, given the circumstances. And we do have advocacy services while people are in our shelter to try to get them into more permanent housing.
Awesome. Thank you, Ingrid, for that. And I'll just almost a shameless plug for Sunrise. One of the things that I've had the opportunity to do with Sunrise is we developed, and I say we, it really was more them, Kat and Kelly, who developed an overlay of what domestic violence and human trafficking look like. And it was an amazing, well-researched product that came from that, a presentation that came from that. In fact, it was one of the programs that was on the Attorney General's Human Trafficking Summit last year, was that particular, the overplay. How they overlay those characteristics overlay. I would encourage you to take a look at that as well, because domestic violence and human trafficking has multiple characteristics that cross over. So they do some amazing work here in the area as well. Dennis, I wanted to just real quickly come to you because I don't want to leave this out. One of the titles or the title of our webinar today was really kind of taking a look at the hospitality industry and the role of human trafficking and how human trafficking awareness training can help mitigate some of the attractiveness that a trafficker. But we talked a lot about hotels and motels. What about some of the other areas that's included in hospitality as well? What's the value of training? And I'm just going to use restaurants and some of the other things as well, but they may be included in that hospitality umbrella. So what's the value of training in those segments as well?
I think that it's incumbent upon everyone to really be involved in this discussion. We're in a state here that's really, our main focus is hospitality. We had 118 million visitors that came to Florida last year throughout the course of 2021. Some areas like the Orlando market, 60 million people a year are coming in. I think it's everyone's job to be involved in this discussion, to be involved in this process. I think the more people that we continue to engage on it is going to be very important moving forward. We're just seeing just an enormous amount of activity here. You just look at the real estate market and the people that are buying second homes here now in Florida, 1,000 people moving here a day, and we're continuing to see more and more influx of folks coming in short and long term. So I think we just need to keep expanding this discussion even more. The prevention for us is a big key. We've been very proactive in that, and we're encouraging everybody to really take part in that even more so as we move forward.
Thank you for that. I want to take a moment because I know everyone who registered and is attending the webinar today understands the importance of awareness and education, but the broader discussion about the issue needs to be elevated and increased in various networks, not just hospitality, but in networks across the state of Florida, whether that's healthcare, hospitality, sports, you name it. There's a broad need to elevate this particular issue in training. But what I'd like to do is have each of you, the panelists here, to take a couple of minutes and just share why working with hospitality and vacation rental organization is so important to increasing awareness about human trafficking. We picked this today, hospitality, for a reason, and that is because the frontline characteristics of the hospitality industry, and not just detecting human trafficking, but also in disrupting the activity of human trafficking in the state of Florida, in particular, utilizing the hospitality industry, which is so important to our state. So taking a couple of minutes, share with us the value of this, why it's so important to you, and really the role that hospitality and vacation rentals has in stopping human trafficking in our state. And I'll start with you, Ingrid.
So when people ask me like the organizations that can be most influential, my immediate response is medical professionals in the hospitality industry. Those are the two that just come to my head first. So medical professionals see survivors of trafficking much more often than believed, but the hospitality industry actually has the act of trafficking happening on its property. And Polaris, the national anti-trafficking organization, states that trafficking networks often rely on legitimate businesses, including hotels, to sustain their illegal operations and infrastructure. So this actually isn't something to dismay over. It's honestly something to get excited about, because your hotels, your rentals, this is your property. This is your domain that you have power over. And human trafficking often feels like too overwhelming of an issue. It's too complex. It's too broad of a system, something that happens far away that we have no control over, but it's not. It's in your domain, a place that you have direct control over. And because the hospitality industry is one of these two major industries that sees trafficking in front of them, you're uniquely positioned to be the forces against this system. The hospitality industry is vital in the fight against trafficking because you can see these signs so often, and it can be a major force for change. Not only by learning the signs and having a standard protocol of what to do in suspecting trafficking, but also by stopping it before it even begins. Especially when it comes to labor trafficking, the hospitality industry can take the stance of looking where it's getting its products. So like not buying from places who refuse to share their supply chain. Work instead with suppliers who have responsibly sourced products. You can start by doing something by switching to fair trade coffee and chocolate, or by shopping at places like Goodweave, the Fair Food Program, or Serve. For labor trafficking, the hospitality industry can stop it before it begins. And for sex trafficking, that's likely happening on their premises, they can play a powerful role in disrupting that cycle. Know the signs, have a protocol of what to do when suspecting trafficking, give the number to the national hotline or to a local hotline out on your hotel paperwork, or wherever 911 or the number for the hospital is located. Just add the trafficking hotline number. If residents use an app, technology is becoming just a bigger and bigger part of this. Have it somewhere there, easily accessible to all who check in. Have posters with the signs to help survivors being trafficked recognize their situation, as many people in trafficking don't know what's happening to them. Know that the worst thing that can happen if you call a hotline and discuss the situation is that you realize it's not trafficking, and then you move on. And as someone who works on a hotline, I can tell you we would be much happier if someone called concerning a situation that obviously wasn't trafficking than not calling at all. Hotels see trafficking in front of them, and that's an exciting truth that can very strongly aid in disrupting the system. We can be the people that refuse to look away when we're uncomfortable and decide to instead look directly at it.
Yeah, that's really good, Ingrid, and thank you for mentioning those things, because one of the things pieces that you mentioned was disrupting the activity. Um, Detecting is critical. That's the first stage, but disruption is so critical. And then we want to dismantle the organizations, and that's more of a law enforcement function. But we all have a role in detecting it and disrupting that activity. And hotels and motels, hospitality has a big role in that. Dennis, to you for some thoughts to share. And right before you answer this, if anybody has an additional question, please put that in the chat, because right after Dennis and Savannah kind of wrap up some of their thoughts with us, we want to answer those questions in a short little session before we wrap up today. But Dennis, to you, some thoughts about hospitality and the industry and combating human trafficking.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in hospitality, everyone's trained to be friendly, to be nice, to work with the guests, to create a guest experience. On the negative side of things, they're looking for, financial transactions, fraud on credit cards, that they're looking down that list of the normal things that they've been trained to do year after year after year. It becomes, I think, where we've now got to look at all the other aspects that we've kind of avoided. We don't want to talk about certain issues, so we push them aside and we just go on our business and do the normal day-to-day hospitality things. We've got one of the biggest hospitality training schools here in the United States. I think it's ranked number 5 in the country, of UCF Rosen College of Hospitality. We need to start getting that type of curriculum and things involved in that discussion those level of schools where we're training folks that are going into hospitality, and just elevate the discussion a little bit more, so that if there's a red flag on a financial transaction and somebody's giving you, well, try this card and try this card, those can also be red flags for something that's happening in human trafficking. And another area, we've seen tons of fraudulent activity with black market credit cards and all the things that are going on in that area. And those can also be some triggers that really identify something even deeper. So I think we just need to continue the discussion and getting more in depth in it. And it's another piece of that hospitality education that has to continue to be talked about and is part of the curriculum that we have moving forward. And with all that's changing in the industry, as I mentioned earlier about, there's a lot of folks that, and I hate to use the term amateurs, but they're getting into the hospitality industry. They're part of it. They need to have that training, and we need so many more resources to get out and to talk to those people and make them understand that it's more than just owning a property and managing that one property. It's about all the other aspects of hospitality, prevention, awareness, everything that comes along with it to be part of that package. And, it's a professionalism that we're trying to impress upon those folks as well. Just get involved and be part of the industry. No matter if you walk away with one new thing when you come to one of these sessions we do, it's probably going to either save someone's life or it's going to be a big plus for your business and what you do on a daily basis.
Thank you, Dennis, for that. I know you mentioned Rosen College. It was interesting because I was just there last week, and they're doing such a great job developing a human trafficking curriculum, a course within their curriculum on hospitality. And the key that they have found and what they have expressed to me and to others as well is that getting human trafficking awareness training to those who are being trained to be the future managers and operators of hotels and motels and restaurants and resorts, getting training to them early so that they have an understanding of what's going on there is really just a critical piece. So they've done a fantastic job. And like you said, they're one of the leading trainers of future hospitality professionals, and they've recognized the value, and they have some really great, passionate people over there who have pushed this right to the top of the mindset of those that they're training. So those that are being released, graduated and then released into the job market in that area from Rosen are going to have a deep understanding of human trafficking as part of their learning experience. So I think that's fantastic that you mentioned that. And a couple of things that both you and Ingrid and Dennis both mentioned in kind of these thoughts. I got to thinking, I have an opportunity to work on a regular basis with people that are part of a team that I work with, AML, the anti-money laundering folks, and they talk about the abnormal use of money, the flow of money, finances, as you mentioned, Ingrid, and finances that you mentioned as well, Dennis, how that moves, and they flag those things, and we talk about it from a money perspective, and we talk about it from an industry perspective, and talk about it as the importance of that. But I think all of us that are on this call recognize that at the end of the day, it's not just the dollar. It's easy to get lost and swamped in statistics. ILO, 40 million victims plus, $150 billion a year, global issue. United States, a top tier consuming country, both labor and sex trafficking. And we can get so caught up in those things, and where Florida ranks and where this state ranks and calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, on and on and on. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, it's a human being. It's someone who's hurting. It's someone whose dreams, their aspirations, their human experience, their human soul is really it. And that trauma that happens to that individual, I think, has to always be in the front part of our mind, to understand that, as Dennis, you said it, and Ingrid both said it, it's about saving someone's life. This kind of training is not just about saving a dollar. It's not about just saying I've done something, but it really is about saving someone's life, saving someone from a world of hurt and trauma. And Savannah, you kind of represent that to us today. You shared your story, your lived experience, the trauma of what happened to you, and some of that, a lot of that happened inside the hospitality industry, inside of a hotel. So I purposely today kind of wanted to bring it to you as kind of the last panelist to kind of speak to this topic before we answer any questions. And that is the value that this panel, this training today, on this morning, the value that it has both personally and professionally to you, to kind of wrap this up for us today.
Yeah, I believe that this training has a lot of value, and I enjoy speaking to hotel staff and helping them with their trainings, because it is so personal to me, because of a lot of my trafficking happening at hotels. And I believe that, like in Florida, with the large hospitality industry that we have, and a lot of sex trafficking happening at hotels, they're in a position where they are able to help stop human trafficking by doing their part in training their staff to recognize and report it. So I think they are a vital part in helping us end human trafficking.
Thank you, Savannah. Thank you to all of you. Aaron, do we have any questions that have been asked that we have not answered that we can do so now?
Yeah, I don't see any questions. I do want to remind everyone that a recording of this webinar will be made available later this week, along with the survey. So we appreciate everyone attending. And if I also put the Florida Alliance website in the chat as well. If there are specific questions, you can also email me. I'll pop my email in the chat also. We just want to thank Alan for facilitating this very important conversation, and to our panelists and partners, Dennis, Savannah, and Ingrid. We're very grateful for your sharing your thoughts today and everything that you do to advocate in our state. So with that, unless Alan, you want to give some final parting words, just want to say again, thank you to everyone for attending.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say and we're not going to prolong this, but the only thing that I would say to everyone, thank you for being part of this. I cannot tell you how many times that I've been part of some kind of training like this, whether as a participant or as a panelist or whatever it may be, and then to come out of something like this and to hear the report a few weeks later, a day later, a couple of days later, that this really made a difference and impacted someone's life, as we mentioned earlier. So thank you for taking the time to be a part of this. In my view, you have invested 90 minutes or so of your time to hear and learn, to observe, to perhaps hear something that maybe you've not heard before. But at the end of the day, it's not just about hearing, but it's about doing. And that's what you are today. You are a doer. You are somebody who's made that commitment that if I see something, I'm trained, but I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to make that call. I'm going to make that report, because in this day, 2022, We have to end human trafficking and let them know it's not going to happen on our watch. So thank you so much for participating.